Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be going through a presentation on building inclusive products and some tips on building them while, as we all know, we are all 100% remote. Um, I am Gaurav. And, I've done a couple of these in the past, but a quick introduction and background on my experience. I've predominantly spent most of my product career in healthcare technology and life sciences, and more recently in the e-commerce space. Most recently I was at Instacart. I had the privilege of working with a fantastic team to build out prescription delivery, right from what was just an idea on a whiteboard to now, we're at nationwide scale with that program. So very interesting, and definitely there are some stories and thoughts from that experience that I'd love to share in terms of how inclusion plays a part when you build products. And right now I'm at a small startup called Mahana Therapeutics, where we are working in the behavioral medicine space. So, trying to work with, building out apps which, help through the process of cognitive behavioral therapy, help, people who suffer from different medical conditions, change their behaviors and help them achieve better outcomes. Yeah, again, an area where we are looking very strongly at inclusion and how we can provide access to such technologies to a broader and broader group of people. And right here on the slide is a link to my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to reach out to me at any point. I'd be happy to answer any questions. All right, so before we actually jump into building inclusive products, I do want to take a couple of minutes here just to talk about setting some context behind why I think it was a great time to talk about inclusion, to talk about diversity when we're building products. Of course, the team at Product School gave me some feedback on, here are some interesting topics that people like to talk about, and inclusion and diversity was one of them, as was how to be successful as a remote PM. But I also think, this has been a very interesting year for pretty much all of us. And this has been the inspiration to talk about this, and hopefully it's an inspiration for you as well, because there's several things going on. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. This bullet point alone can have 20, 30, 40 sub bullet points under it. And I bring this up specifically from the perspective of inclusion and wanting to build an inclusive product, because what this pandemic has shown us is, other than the grim statistics around the number of cases and the deaths caused by it, but it's also showing us this very clear sort of disparity in access, where there's people who have access to healthcare, or even in some cases sheltering in place and being socially distant are privileges that not everyone has, and that to me is a key point in talking about inclusion when it comes to the pandemic. We're also seeing disparities in how families are being affected by this. There's a record number of women who have had to leave the workforce because of typical gender rules or norms around taking care of kids, and that's another thing around inclusion and diversity that we need to think about, that the pandemic has shown us. So those two are just very the top of the things that come to mind, but there are so many other things that the pandemic has shown us, which we're in this moment where we need to really think as product professionals, whether you're a seasoned PM or an aspiring PM, to think about all the things that 2020 is showing us with just this first aspect here. The second thing that we see here, and this is probably very specific to the United States, but we are seeing a lot of things come out in terms of racial injustice and polarization. We're at a very interesting moment in time in America, where we are again seeing these inequalities coming in, and everything to do with inclusion is to sort of try and see how can we get inspiration from events that are happening around us, and use that and channel that energy into creating products which over time that we can pass down to future generations, get rid of some of these things. And so we're at this very interesting time where we are seeing a lot of this happen, where a lot of these differences are coming up. And we need to understand more than ever that inclusion is about conversation. It's about not just being right about your perspective or and someone else's perspective is incorrect. It's about how do you find equality between those perspectives. And finally, again, this is specific to some of us here in the United States, especially in California and the South and the Eastern states. California has been ravaged by wildfires. And I live in San Francisco. We've had several incidents where we can't even step out of the house because there's just so much. The air has so much PM 2.5 particles. And the southern and states and some of the east, there's tornadoes and hurricanes, and people are being evacuated, and they go back home, and then again, you get another one. And so there are all of these events that are happening just in the short period of 2020. We are in the beginning of November here. But there's a lot, and I wanted to set this context before actually talking about inclusion and how you bring that into a product, because it's important to understand that there's a journalist who I follow called Amy Walter, and she said about basically all of this that take for example the Renaissance that happened way back in the 14, 15, 1600s in Europe. When people were in the middle of it, no one labeled it or called it the Renaissance. That happened after the fact, when people looked back and said, oh my gosh, that was a time where there was this great inspired moment for people to just come together in the arts and sciences and build things. And I think we're in a similar moment, in a different context, but we are living in 2020 right now. We're in the middle of this renaissance of thinking that needs to happen, of how we can bring in all our minds, all these perspectives from all over the place, and how can we use what we are seeing around us for greater good. So with that, let's jump right into it. So inclusion in product, and I will preface this with, but I'm no expert in diversity and inclusion or any of those subjects. These are just some learnings that I have come across that I have found helpful in the last couple of roles that I've been a PM in. Where I've had to think about, beyond your typical user and how you bring them into your product. And I will talk a little bit about that as we go along this webinar. But I did want to set, in a classic PM sense, I've always talked about the PM 101 is, as product managers, you talk about the what and the why, and that's what you need to focus on. So let's talk about the what and the why of inclusion in product. So what is inclusion, right? So there's many definitions. There are many people who have careers built purely on inclusion. From the perspective of product management, I think, and this goes even beyond just building products. I think inclusion begins with empathy and empathizing with human problems and situations. And you'll hear a lot of people use the term empathy or user empathy in product. I want us to take a step back from just user empathy and just talk about empathy as itself, where it's essentially you put yourself in the other person's shoes. You take someone shares something with you, and one way to respond is with sympathy, which is a very different thing. Empathy is actually saying, hey, I may or may not have experienced what you've experienced, but I want to put myself in your shoes and feel the way you're feeling, and make and have that connection of feeling the way you're feeling. So when it comes to product management and doing that, I think it's a very key aspect of having the humanness here, of being able to think about it as another human being would. The other part of inclusion, and at a very high level, is encouraging a very diverse conversation. And this is a very broad bullet point, but the key word here is diverse, is that you want to get as many voices in as possible, right? And so the minute you start going across the room, beyond the room, you go to your community, you go to a country and beyond, and when you start having those voices coming up, and you're encouraging the diversity of it, not just the same group, but different groups, and then even more different groups. That I think is a big part of inclusion. And then finally, as a part of all of this, you finally come up to stories, and you want to make every story heard. So there's one aspect of hearing. There are many stories that come about, but you want to make all of them heard, ideally, in a more realistic sense. In shipping products, especially software products, you probably will get, there'll be a small subset that'll be left out, but it is our job as product managers to make that list as small as possible or completely eliminate it, so that you can ultimately say that you're having the story of everything being heard. So in short, like if I summarize all of this and some of the words I've highlighted here, inclusion, especially in the product management sense of building products, is empathizing with a diverse set of stories. So you're not only putting yourself in the position of that other human being and what they're experiencing, you're not only just expanding the universe of people that you're talking to through diversity, but you're also making those stories heard. And so that is in my mind, a simple way of framing what is inclusion. Now let's talk about why is inclusion important. There's obviously many answers to this question. This is again my take on why I think it's important. So let's take the first word I brought up in the previous slide, which was empathy. So empathy drives connection with the product. And what I mean by this is, if you build a product which has factored in the lived experience of someone else, and keep in mind, you may not experience this at all, if ever, but you've factored in that experience of someone else into your product. Then when they actually start using their product, your product, they feel that sense of connection. And then you have this growing user base which are connecting with your product, just because in the design process or in the building process, you've taken the time to empathize and not just voice your own thoughts on what goes into the product, but bringing all of that in. The second keyword from my previous slide was a diverse set of points of view. And diversity guides product design. And in a very good example here, and I want to bring in some of my experiences. Like right now at Mahana, we're building these applications where, as I mentioned, it's in behavioral medicine. You're trying to coach people on how they can use their thoughts and their emotions to change behaviors, and improve the symptoms of their conditions. And a very simple example here is when I first came in, and this is the very, very, very initial version of this product, a lot of the pictures just represented one racial group, white people. And there was nothing intentional about it. But then when you look at the cross section of who suffers from this particular disease that we're trying to work with, or syndrome that we're trying to work with, it affects everyone. And a simple thing in the design change was like, hey, let's use illustrations and images and videos of all races, all genders, and bring that into our product. How do we design this experience now? How do we now start thinking about the images and color schemes and tones of the product that appeal to one subset of the population? How does that differ from the other one? And how can we build that into our product? How can we make a product, again, going back to the first bullet, when someone has their first touch point or their second or their nth touch point, how do you drive that connection to them? So thinking about these things really helps provide connection, and also a design that is very inclusive. And then finally, the last keyword I brought up was around stories. And stories are central to the product experience. And I'm going to double click on experience here. I specifically mean not user experience or the UX. We have kind of covered that in the second bullet. The product experience is part of that story that is bigger than your product. And what I mean by this is, take for example, the app I'm just talking about now, or even at Instacart, before you create your grocery delivery order, many things kind of happen, for that user story before they begin to use your application. They might have lost, simple example, someone might have lost someone during COVID, or they know someone that lost someone. Someone had a hard day at work, then they come to your app. Someone went out for a run and got injured, and at some point they can't start using your app. So there are all these larger than life things that happen outside of your product, which need to at some point become the experience of your product. And how can you build again an experience by thinking, what if someone were to open this app when their state of mind is neutral, or if they're happy, or if they're sad, or if they're anxious? And thinking through those things can be a very simple thing where, a little widget shows up in your app and saying like, how are you doing today? And you have like a little smiley scale. And based on that, you can define what the rest of the user experience in the app is. So taking into account or including the story that someone is bringing before they even touch your product is also inclusion, and something that we should think about. And so to summarize all of this, inclusion is important to validate the lived experience of others. And the lived experience here is the key thing to understand. It may not be your experience, but it is someone else's experience, and it is a valid experience as well. And that's a key thing for a realization that I've had, is that I may not experience a lot of the things that a lot of other people are doing it. I have different enablers in my life. I have different privileges because of which I'm afforded the life I have. But there are also other situations and scenarios that people are living in. And those are absolutely valid. So inclusion is about bringing in all those lived experiences and validating it in your product. So when you create a product which drives connection, when you create a product which has the design, and when you create a product that brings in the experience, you're validating the user. And so when they touch your product, they feel included right from the get-go. So here's some key learnings now. Let's talk about some of the things I've learned over the last couple of years, specifically thinking about inclusion. Some of the key things that helped me. The first one, and I say this, I've said this in other webinars, I say it every single time I talk about product management. You got to listen. And specifically, you got to get comfortable with being the note taker. A little side story in this: years ago, when I was a young junior PM, I used to get offended anytime someone in the meeting told me, "Hey, Gaurav, take notes." And I used to be like, "What? So you mean I can't contribute? Like, what do you mean? I'm just supposed to take notes?" But then over the years, as you start to actually listen, you realize that the role of the note taker is actually one of the most powerful, because you're truly not doing anything else. You're just listening. And that is a very strong thing when it comes to just overall general product management. But I think specifically when you talk about inclusion, is to listen, because what you're trying to do is, let's talk about some of the things I spoke about earlier. Empathy. You're trying to put yourself in someone's shoes. You cannot do that without 100% listening. Almost got to think of it as when you're in the process of listening, whether it's a one-on-one conversation or in a meeting, that the person in front of you or the people around you are the most important people in the world right now. So nothing else really should distract you from that. So that's one big part of it. Read and just research. Just research everything. Do user research. As an example, both at Instacart and Mahana, we take user research very seriously. Everything that we try to do is researched and researched and researched. We try to get as many thoughts in, and keep in mind, a lot of this data that you're getting is not quantitative, right? You can't throw it on a dashboard and quickly get an insight. You actually have to read through these interviews that have happened with people who've touched your product, and they've told you, hey, this did not work for me because I can't do X. And I'll give you an example here. Like at Instacart, at one point, this didn't actually finally happen, but it's still important that we talked about it. we were doing research on placing a prescription delivery, and we found out that there was this person who doesn't have a credit card, and you're an e-commerce platform. Your entire basis of your product is predicated around putting in 4 or 5 fields, which processes a transaction. But we still had to understand the problem to an extent of how do we solve for this user then? They only want to deal in cash. And how do you do that? It's 2020. You know, who does cash on delivery? But there is that use case. There is that subset that, you know, don't trust electronic systems. They don't trust credit cards. They only trust cash going from one hand to the other. We had to really think about it, and finally came up with a hacky way, but we were like, okay, we'll figure it out. So all of that comes from listening, and again, reading and understanding truly what people are looking for in some cases. Then, you know, after you do the first 2 things, thinking, you know, as a product manager, I spend a lot of my working time, which is whether I'm running or doing the dishes or something like that, to just think, you know, just think about the problem, frame it. But the key thing here is what's after the comma. Do not judge. Don't, you know, the minute you go to a meeting with the list of the user problems and you say, oh, this one's an easy one to solve. Or this thing, you know what, this feature, this problem is not going to take engineering too long. You've already put a judgment on it. You've already put a label of this is something easy versus something that's difficult. Let that come from the 4th bullet, which is the communication, the community around you. You know, surround yourself with diverse voices. You know, as PMs, we typically, most of the time, engage with engineering, and here and there, depending on your level of product manager in the organization, you interface with you know, your executives, or you know, with maybe marketing and sales sometimes. But I've said this other times as well, engage with other teams, you know, engage with people who do not have the same background as you, who may not speak the same language as you, who do not look like you, both at work and outside. Specifically at work, talk to support. I think customer support, they're the eyes and ears of your product. They literally know things that product managers do not know. Bring them in. Talk to, you know, in my role, I work with the clinical team. They're clinical researchers, they're clinicians. They don't know how to think like product managers, but they are the brains behind the algorithms and some of the things that we build. So expand your circle of who you're communicating with, and try to bring all of that in. And finally, I think, you know, as product managers, when you, whether it is a product at a company or multiple products or multiple companies, we have a platform. We have a privilege of being able to like have this position based on all the things that I framed up front about we're in 2020, we're seeing all these things happening around us. We have that platform to bring that into our product. And so really, we should hold ourselves accountable for a product being inclusive or not. You know, just to summarize it, you know, your voice, my voice, is an N of 1. You know, it's one opinion, it's one thought, and it's one perspective. So get out there and try to get as many as you can. All right, so switching gears here a little bit from inclusion, I want to talk a little bit about what it's been like being a remote PM. The fun story here is I actually left my role at Instacart and joined Mahana literally a week before the pandemic hit, and we all had stay-at-home orders. So I actually joined my new team 100% remote. So I've only been in the office once to do the interviews. So I've met like the people who interviewed me, not met anyone else, working with them every single day. So some tips here on how to make that happen. The first one, and I've kind of broken this out into 2 sections. This is the documentation piece, and the next one will be around conversations. So in terms of documentation, I've used this thing called a product brief. You know, it's a very simple document. It basically just talks about what's the problem you're solving, or all the problems you're solving, and kind of like what's the solutions you're looking at. Now, in the process of having all these conversations, if you were in the office, you'd have it in person, and then you finally summarize the bullets, right? and you get out of there. In this remote scenario, I've found it very useful of writing everything down. I basically, again, going back to my previous slide, be the note taker. Take notes, just write everything down. And then what I do is I keep revisiting it and I strike through things which are like, oh yeah, we scratched that idea. We didn't do this. And the reason that's useful is because in this, especially in this world of us being remote and in front of computer screens, being able to revisit something and be like, oh yeah, we actually thought about that. And this is the reason why we scratched it out. Very useful. Team priorities. This is a very useful document that works whether you're a junior PM, you're managing other PMs. It's a very simple who, what's the status doc. So not tracking, we do tracking in Jira or other tools. It's a very simple and very powerful thing for as a product team or a product and design team or whatever configuration you have to every week have a quick 15, 20 minute stand up, whatever you want to call it, where everyone's just quickly put in the who, what. And the reason this is important is sometimes when you're physically in the office, you can look over at someone and be like, hey, I need your help on X, right? You can't do that now because we're all remote. So use this document to kind of put in, hey, I need help from so-and-so on this thing on Wednesday, and you know, get those things in there. Whiteboard in advance. So I had originally titled the slide slightly differently, but I changed it. I call it remote PM and in quotes, losing the whiteboard. It's probably the most disappointing thing of working remotely as a product manager, because I've spent most of my PM life in front of a whiteboard. But that being said, doesn't mean we've lost whiteboards forever. They will come back someday when we get back into the office. But whiteboard in advance. And the reason I do this is there are sort of many tools out there. I mean, you can message me if you want to know what I use. I've tried them all. They all have pluses, minuses, but the main message here is come prepared. So whiteboard something in advance and then break it down and throw it all out, because you'll save a lot of time because everyone's remote. And this one, the last one here, I think is super important, especially when everyone's working remotely and you want to be effective. You got to pre-read or silent read. So ahead of any brainstorm, ahead of any whiteboarding, you have your document put together, clearly articulate what's the problem you're solving, right? That's PM 101. Like what's the problem you're trying to solve? What are some constraints maybe? And put it in there, be as descriptive or not, but make sure people are spending time either reading before the meeting, or you start the meeting and you say, you know, first 10 minutes, let's all just read, put some music on so it's not awkward, and just do a silent read. Now let's talk about conversations, right? So that was the whole documentation piece of what's helped me being a remote PM. Here's the conversation piece, the big part, the reason why we built offices and human beings all got together and started with cubicles and broke them down. And now we're going back to it. Who knows? Conversations, right? Swing by their desk. You used to be able to do this when you're in an office. You just walk by and you ask a question. Now you got to do it in remote, but I still think it's important. It's actually very valuable and saves a lot of time. Just get a quick chat going. You know, you have a question for someone that cannot be answered by a single response in Slack. That's my rule. If someone cannot give me everything I need by them writing one thing in Slack, I do this. I'm like, do you have a few minutes to chat? Send a Zoom invite, get it done, and it's super effective. So the swing by the desk really does work in the remote world as well. Be the concierge. As a product manager, we bring people together and we help people. So, you know, think of a hotel experience that you might have had. How can I help you? Just ask it on repeat. I Slack people throughout the day, whether they are other PMs, whether they are engineers, whether they are on the clinical team, what have you. And I'm like, how can I help you with one of the things you're doing today, right? And this kind of goes back to the doc that I talked about, where the status, the team status doc of who's doing what. Keep asking this question. And it's super important because, again, when you're physically in an office, you're able to do this easily. But keep that up by doing it over Slack if possible. Rally behind the vote. So this is actually a huge thing for me, even in pre-COVID times when you would actually be in person, but even more important since people are remote now. if there's ever a meeting where you have a big group that's meeting and they're talking about this big ugly topic that there's disagreement and dissonance and agreement and smiles and frowns, please, please, please do one-on-ones with all of those people separately first. And especially being remote right now, time is of the essence. Everyone has families, everyone has like kids running around in the background. You don't, in a bigger meeting, as you progressively get bigger and bigger, the productivity just tanks when you're remote, right? So make sure you do yourself and everyone else in your company a favor by being effective, by saying, hey, I think I need to understand who's aligning on some of these things, who has just, is disagreeing, but kind of like agreeing to commit and move on, and try to get that done before you bring everyone to the meeting, because then you'll be super effective. And finally, this one's a little bit of the small talk part of it, if you will, but rather than doing the whole, hey, how was your weekend? Or what did you do this weekend? Or when it comes, when it's Friday, we are like, oh, what are you doing this weekend? Take some time, especially if this works, if you have your team syncs, whether it's a stand-up, if it's cross-functional, do it, whatever works for you. An interesting one to switch to is actually, what's your win this week? And this can be both professionally or in your personal life. Like, what are you happy about that happened this week? And again, as I said, it's 2020. There's a lot going on this year. So you want to get people to bring in some of that positivity with them as well. So do this. It's actually pretty helpful, especially since we can't physically connect, be in the same presence as other people. You can't connect, as humans together. So this has helped me kind of like, bring in some positivity before we actually start the real business. Just to summarize all of this, product management, we're the glue between people and conversations, and doing these things has helped me actually maintain that gluiness over the last few months. So with that, wear a mask, avoid crowds, be safe, and thank you very much. And please do reach out to me if you have any questions.